So Crystal asks a question connected right to the end part of this talk about, did the U.S. actually have any leverage to, enforce the Monroe Doctrine? I mean, maybe the counterfactual would be, what if all the nations of Europe just ignored the Monroe Doctrine? And maybe they did.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the answer is not a lot. I mean, it helped them to rhetorically frame diplomatic discussions going forward. But the leverage really came from Monroe and Adams's awareness that Britain also didn't want Russia or Austria, for instance, to try to recolonize parts of the Western Hemisphere. So the US was basically very cannily gambling here that if somehow European absolutists did try to recolonize part of the Americas or build new colonies in the Americas, that Britain was going to try to stop them anyway. And Britain really did have the leverage to do that. So it's a really canny calculation. And if you read what the British Foreign Minister George Canning says about this, he totally gets what the United States is doing. He's really kind of irritated because he had wanted the US and Britain to issue a joint statement, and then the US goes and steals his thunder by issuing this Monroe Doctrine. And Britain and Canning know, the US is taking credit for putting forth this idea that Britain really had an interest in implementing anyway. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I thought that was terrific. So I actually have a question I want to ask you. I love the framework of the United States as the anti-colonial imperial power, emerging power. And one of the old explanations of the War of 1812 in the historiography, which seems like it never goes away, maybe it's one of these zombie ideas, is that the US really wanted Canada, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can add other territories to that too, like Cuba. I wonder, through your research, what you think of that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that's a piece of it, right? And part of it comes from the tension between the United States and British Canada, and this feeling that that Canadians would kind of rally to join the United States if the U.S. invaded them. And so I think there really is an expectation that if British Canadians have the chance, that they'll join the United States and expand the U.S. at the direct expense of the British Empire, public enemy number one of the Jeffersonian vision. So yeah, I think that's a big piece of it, both because again of the sort of economic interest and the geopolitical interest of getting that land, but also because taking British Canada would be such a slap in the face to the scurrilous British Empire, right? So absolutely, I do think that's a piece of it. I don't know what I don't know if that is
Yeah, no,
if
I
you have
think
a
that's
similar view.
interesting. Yeah, because I think the consensus lately has been that it's just a tactic of the war, like the invasion of Canada. They take, if say America takes Canada, then they're going to use that as a negotiating piece. But I agree with you. I think if America then does take Canada, it's hard to see them giving it back, right?
Yeah.
So no, it's a really interesting question. So we had another one come in, which is a fantastic question. Um, did the Monroe Doctrine tee up manifest destiny? Do you see a
Yeah.
connection between those things?
That is such a great question. I mean, so the term manifest destiny itself doesn't appear until the 1840s. It comes from it first appears in print in a Democratic newspaper in New York. Um, so as a concept, the historian in me sort of wants to root manifest destiny in that historical moment of the 1840s leading to the war with Texas. But the United States had been expansionist from the beginning. Thomas Jefferson called the United States an empire for liberty. So he himself is conceptualizing the United States as an empire. In his mind, it's a benign empire that's going to spread liberty to these white American yeomen. But I mean, he clearly, like, he is clearly expansionist in his thinking here. And that thinking relies on the assumption that these white yeoman farmers would dispossess native people and force them off their land, and in much of the country, bring their slaves as well. So a lot of the sort of racialized assumptions that became so explicit in Manifest Destiny were kind of implicit in a lot of that earlier Jeffersonian rhetoric of the empire for liberty. So maybe one difference would be that by the 1840s, there were different ideas about race. Ideas that race was more biologically rooted had become more common by the 1840s, whereas in the early 19th century, those ideas are still kind of developing and in flux. The other thing is, and maybe we'll talk a bit about this when we get to some of the documents, I think that the 1810s and 20s are a moment of, maybe we could call it like greater optimism and even universalism in US thinking about the rest of the world and the other nations and other people's abilities to establish republics. So this is something I look at in my book, right? That everybody in the United States knew that Latin Americans were Catholic. And most people knew, because this was widely reported in newspapers, that most of these new Spanish American republics were implementing very gradual anti-slavery laws. And they knew, or at least believed, that Spanish Americans were building multiracial republics. Now, in fact, I don't want to contribute to a myth that Spanish America was like a racial democracy in this period, because a lot of what happens in Spanish America is like citizenship for African American men and mestizos on paper that doesn't always bear out in reality. But in the United States, it's widely believed that these are multiracial republics south of the border. And to my surprise, what I found in my research was white US audiences were actually very kind of excited about this, especially when it was happening far away in South America. They were like, oh my gosh, this is actually, this is kind of exciting. One newspaper editor says that any people are susceptible of the blessings of a republic. And so I think that there's a way in which before that moment of Manifest Destiny, there's this earlier possibility that maybe Latin Americans, for all their differences, could pull off Republican government. And maybe in some ways, for example, when it comes to slavery, do better than the United States. And by the idea of Manifest Destiny, or by the time of Manifest Destiny later, a lot of those earlier notions of universalist possibility had been replaced by more hardened notions of racial difference. And also by then, there's a lot more US settlers and colonists in Texas. So there's a kind of stronger territorial dispute there as well. And I'm sure that's a story that all of you in Texas as history teachers know very well. And we can certainly talk more about that if you want.
All right, that's great. That's a great example of an excellent question leading to an excellent answer. That's really interesting how these things kind of rhyme, but not exactly the same. So we can transition, I think, into the primary documents.